Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Let's Talk Astrology. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by our highly esteemed faculty member, Kathy Rose. So, thank you so much for joining us today. And how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to talk to you. As always, you're about the most wonderful host anybody could ever have in one of these things.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, you put together such beautiful presentations, so I'm excited for this one today. So, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the importance of the angles, particularly when we're looking at activation by arcs and transits. And part of this presentation, we're talking here about the signs of presidential power, which is a very poignant topic right now as we're in election season. I've just become an American citizen, so I'm registered to vote. So this is going to be a very interesting topic. So Kathy, you put together a fantastic presentation together as always. So let's dive in.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. We're going to be talking about how big events happen when angles are activated, not only in this case, using the example of people running for president or being elected as president, but in life in general. And the point I'm going to make, and this relates to the course I teach at Kepler, the prediction practicum, I like to simplify. I like to focus on what's most important to embrace. So we're going to talk about Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, and we're also going to bring in RFK because there's been some development with him. So let's dive in. And the first thing, to me, the angles are the most important part of the chart. They're crosshairs of time and space. I am a modern astrologer, so I have to say right now that I personally use the Placidus house cusps, and I use modern rulerships. So I like to have my chart set up where the angles are crosshairs. Now, and other people can do what they want, but that's the orientation you're going to see here. And the reason I like that is because it helps my eye really appreciate those dynamic cardinal points of the chart. So crosshairs of time and space, so very, very important. They're the most sensitive zones of the horoscope, and they act like antenna of awareness. So, of course, we know if a natal planet is conjunct an angle, that planet is going to take on more power and strength in the life purpose development. You know, natal planets on angles stand out and we give them more attention. But the same is true when we have a transit or a solar arc to an angle. And I like to think of it in terms of it's a turning point in life, for development of our purpose, for development of the track that we're on at that time, when the angles are activated by arcs or transits. So here's a nice handy dandy nifty little graphic that I have created. And this is a graphic that I use in the Prediction Practicum course. I call it the hierarchy of measurement. Now, this is my opinion. I did not get this from the ancients. It's not in a book somewhere. This is what works for me after doing 42 years of consultations every single day practically with clients. Okay, so I believe what is most important in the hierarchy of measurements, of course, will be conjunctions. Conjunctions are like atomic bombs. Bam, they create incredible movement. So at the top of the list for power in life development would be a solar arc or a transit conjunct to an angle. Second to that would be a solar arc or transit conjunct to the ruler of an angle. And I use modern rulerships, as I said, but maybe you don't, so apply it as you do your astrology. Third in the hierarchy of measurement, I believe, would be a square to from a solar arc or a transit to an angle. So when you have any solar arc at all, or an outer planet transit, square, and angle. And then fourth would be a square or an opposition to the ruler of an angle. I mean, we're saying the same thing here. Now, I stick to conjunction squares and oppositions primarily because they are the aspects that create development. They have tension, they move things forward. So we're going to be looking at these charts with this in mind. Okay.
This is absolutely brilliant graphic that you have. And I would recommend if people want to screenshot this is absolutely brilliant. So the top of the hierarchy, you've got either the arc or the transit conjunct angle, which becomes very loud. And you've got the different ones as you go down. But as you mentioned there, you can't create a diamond without that tension or that rough. So that life development, I think that's a really excellent point.
And the other thing is, even though I teach the prediction practicum, the subtitle for that course is The Art of Forecasting. So let's just say you have a major conjunction to the descendant by arc or transit, or maybe both. I don't predict absolutely that what has to happen would be in terms of the descendant. First thing I do is say, powerful life development. And then what I try to do is find out what's currently going on, what is the reality of that client? Because if they're retired and nothing much is happening, that conjunction to the descendant's going to play out differently than if they are in the middle of a career, depending on what's happening in life. But I'll be talking about that as we go through these slides.
And a quick question, what are your thoughts on the personal planets versus the outer planets, particularly if an outer planet, say Uranus, is retrograding, going back and forth over an angle?
Mm-hmm. When it's by transit, I'm really looking at Jupiter out to Pluto. And by transit, when it's retrograding back and forth and spends a year, or Neptune or Pluto can spend up to 2 years, it's phenomenally significant. And it's from the first contact to the last contact. And the interesting thing is, what I'm going to illustrate with these presidential charts is that action can take place anytime in that cycle. It doesn't have to be when it's exact. And I find too many astrologers only focus on when something exact. And quite often things happen in between those exact hits. One of the things I teach in the prediction practicum is called Big Bells and Little Bells, and that's in lesson number 4. And it's those big bells and little bells, the little bell hits, which are inner planet conjunctions, eclipses, lunations, that often will trigger the big bell, which is the bigger cycle. But that's a lot of technical stuff here.
I love that. It's like ding, 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 and then bang, 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 bang.
Exactly. And I do hear the chart. You can train yourself to try to hear the contact or experience it through feeling in the chart, certainly. Okay. So let's begin with some very interesting examples. Barack Obama. And what was fascinating about his case is he had an instantaneous opening to become a rising star when he spoke at the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, in July of 2004. He talked about the audacity of hope. And he went from being relatively unknown to a superstar, which then put him into the trajectory to win the presidential election in 2008. So let's look at his chart and see what's going on. So you're going to see that on screen, I have the solar arcs listed as equals. Solar arc Venus equals Sun. One of the things I teach is that if we're working with conjunction squares and oppositions with solar arcs, it doesn't matter to me if it's a square or an opposition or a conjunction, really. It's contact, contact, contact. Certainly in my brain, based on that hierarchy of measurement, the conjunction is at the top of the list. But I like to delete the aspect when I do my notations and just put the equal. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at is how angles or ruler of angles are activated in these key moments for these people and for Barack Obama. I want to point out that solar arc Venus equaled the Sun by conjunction, and the Sun rules the descendant. Even if it didn't rule the descendant, the Sun is so powerful. But what's fascinating is that was exact in October of 2003, and he gave this speech in July of 2004. So one thing I want to say about arcs, solar arcs, they're active for a year, 6 months before they're exact, 6 months thereafter, after they are exact. And that's important to understand because we do start to feel it. It becomes active in our life 6 months before and it stays active 6 months after. So Venus equaled Sun, which is one of the most glorious cycles. I mean, receiving an arc from Venus to any planet, especially the sun, moon, or an angle, I mean, that's just beautiful. That's receiving blessings. That's receiving popularity, magnetism, charm. And Barack Obama is highly keyed to charm. He's got that natal Venus. So what you're going to see on screen, the outer ring are the solar arcs set for July 1st of 2004. When he gave the speech, it was July 27th, but that's okay. And the inner ring is the natal chart, just so you know. So you see Venus equaling the sun in July was slightly past. It was slightly beyond his sun, but you know what? That opened the door for him to have popularity. It opened the door for him to have blessings. It happened before that speech. It opened the door for him to be selected as the keynote speaker. I think it is so important not to view just the planetary activity for the date something happened, but to look at what was leading up to it and where's it going. Okay. In addition to that, at the time when he gave the speech, he had solar arc Saturn equaling Pluto, and in this case, it was an opposition. So if you see my cursor, Saturn was over here in the first house, opposite Pluto, which is in his 7th house, and modern rulership, Pluto rules his midheaven. Now, this is what's interesting. You know, a lot of people would go, ooh, Saturn contacting Pluto, that's bad. That's heavy. That's negative. I don't quantify or look at bad or good, positive or negative with these cycles. I say it's contact, it's energy. Saturn equals Neptune by arc or by transit. Saturn conjunct square or opposite Pluto by transit. It's hard work pays off. And that doesn't have to be bad. It's hard work pays off. But the reason I wanted to show this is because Pluto ruled the midheaven. It was exact in September 2004. So he gave this speech just prior to it. And it wasn't bad at all. It was a very positive thing. And he had transit Neptune opposite his sun for 2003 and 2004. A lot of people would go, oh, transit Neptune, that's bad. That's bad. That's confusing. That's wipeout. That's deception. And I never think that. I think, okay, it could possibly be if life is off track, you could use it that way.
It's quite interesting because natally it does have that Sun-Neptune square. And I always think about that identity crisis he's had throughout his life. So where he's talking about the dreams of his father. So if he already understands the energy, maybe that transit of the opposition to the sun, he understands that. Now he's telling people who he is, who his identity is. And I find it interesting here with the outer planets and the generational planets. For me, with the Saturn, Pluto, Uranus, Pluto going on, I've got this sense of bringing down barriers or putting down the status quo or destroying the status quo as he came through as a brilliant star. That was the feeling I got around this time for his brilliant speech that he gave. And just a brilliant orator altogether.
Yes. A very charming man. He has Venus at the Aries point in his natal chart. Venus is at 1 Cancer, which one of the brushstroke techniques I use is the Aries point. And the Aries point opens up high visibility per the frequency of that planet. So Obama has always been a very, very charming person. He would hold the audience captive in the palm of his hand with his charm. He'd light up that brilliant smile and people would swoon. So then on top of it all, receiving the arc from Venus just activated that whole thing. So, you know, and interestingly enough, the speech he gave, the audacity of hope, while transit Neptune was opposite his sun, that's just beautiful. That's just beautiful. And transit Uranus opposite Pluto, as you mentioned, happening at the same time. So the bottom line is, if we were to look at this in advance and know nothing about this person, and if we formed a negative interpretation because, ooh, some of these are really harsh, I think that's unfair. So I try to look at it neutral And then I asked the client some questions. What's currently going on in your life? Well, I'm in politics. I'm elected to an office, and I just got this big opportunity to speak at the convention. I'm going to look at these differently in that case. Okay.
That's a really great point, bringing in the context for the client. So asking question, what's going on in their life? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a destructive period. It could be quite constructive. And certainly for Barack Obama at this time, launched him and his career after this.
Absolutely. All right. So then if we advance the chart, now the arcs are set for January 20th, 2009. That's when he was inaugurated. So let's just back up a little. One of the things I like to teach students is if you are looking at that outer ring of the chart, and those outer rings are talking about solar arcs, you can spin it forward and backward in time, 1 degree per year of life. So we see for 2009, when he was inaugurated, solar arc Venus was conjunct the descendant. I'm going to show that in the next slide. This slide is talking about preparing to run for president in 2007, prior to when Venus hit the descendant. But, you know, if I were looking at this and he was my client and he said, I think I'm going to run for president. And I was looking at this in 2007 and I saw the Venus equals descendant approaching. And I saw Venus equaled sun when he had that big break. Well, you know what you would tend to project, right? But at the time when he was preparing to run for president, transit Neptune on his ascendant, transit Saturn conjunct the descendant, angular contact. Angular contact. So first and foremost, without evaluating, is it good contact? Is it bad contact? Because I personally have given up this sense of malefics. I gave that up a long time ago. Not everybody has, and that's cool, but I have. So that if I see contact from Saturn, I go, cool, hard work. Contact from Neptune, wonderful, inspiration.
Well, what I find interesting with that Saturn, and of course, I view charts slightly differently, but natally, it's a dignified Saturn domicile. Yes, it's retrograde in the 12th, but I feel as it's come into that conjunction of the descendant, it's spent all of that time below the horizon. Mm-hmm. Now it's coming up to the forefront. It's about to become visible as it starts to extend its time in the upper half of the chart, the visible part and the public part. So that's quite an interesting, I've never seen this before, and that really is quite remarkable.
Yeah, 100% agree with you. And Grant Louis talked about that in his books. And he talked about the quadrature of Saturn. And when Saturn by transit hits the descendant, it is an emergence period. And that time frame from when Saturn hits the descendant by transit and moves up to the midheaven, generally about 7 years. My phrase is, when Saturn's on the rise, the career's on the rise, unless you are underachieving or off track. Okay. So, now we go to when he was elected president, November of 2008, and we see transit Saturn opposite Pluto. Pluto again rules that midheaven, so he had a lot of contact to Pluto during these times, the ruler of his midheaven. The other thing is, in February of 2008, the year he was elected, earlier in the year, he had what's called the solar arc accumulated semi-square, which is a very important time. You know, the semi-square is a 45-degree angle. So you're thinking solar arc accumulated semi-square, you know that's going to be either when the person is 45 or 46 years old. And that is an important time frame for life correction, making big choices. You know, when you're thinking 45 years old, you're usually making some big decisions about career because you need to. Solar arc Venus on his descendant, transit Pluto opposite that AP Venus in January of 2009, when he was inaugurated. So when an AP planet, an Aries point planet, receives contact, because the Aries point planet, or angle in some cases, allows you to shine, it's a high visibility potential, and it received contact from Pluto, and it rules an angle, it rules the IC, and of course he was shining. He was inaugurated as president, and he was practically worshipped. People adored Obama.
You know what? I wish I was in the United States at that time. I had a friend who went to Washington, the inauguration, and people just couldn't move for the amount of people. out there. So that would have been a magical time. I wish I was a part of that.
I have a lot of clients who currently work in the White House or have worked in the White House, and we're in direct contact with a lot of these presidents. And they said, absolutely, there was a palpable magnetic wave around Obama, and you could feel it from 100 yards away.
Wow. Wow.
It
I hope
was,
we get the same feeling in January, but that's for a different video.
that's right. All right. So Obama was reelected in 2012. And I have listed on screen here, he had solar arc sun equals Venus middle of 2012. Now, this is talking about the square. So if you look on the chart and you see my cursor, the sun was at 28 Virgo. This is still set for 2009. So this is where I want to train people to advance planets by solar arc with your brain. So in 2009, solar arc sun was at 28 Virgo, which is the beginning of the Aries point, by the way. Aries point begins at 29 mutable and goes all the way through 1 cardinal. So one of the things I teach is when we have an arc hitting the Aries point, that is another opportunity for us to shine. But 3 years later, the sun would have equaled Venus by square. And again, high visibility potential. I mean, he was just on a roll. It's beautiful. Okay. So
and really for that election, they were calling it very close, or they thought it was going to be close. I think the last polls show maybe a point difference, but eventually it was fairly comfortable. Even
exactly.
the popular vote in the Electoral College, it was actually, fairly comfortable in the end for Obama.
And I remember looking at his chart for that election going, oh, no worries. No worries. He's blessed by Venus. I mean, come on.
So the beauty of astrology, looking ahead and being comforted by certain things that you're wonderful. I love that.
Yeah. Okay, so after Obama was very much keyed to the frequency of Venus. This has been my central message for a long time. He was a Venusian. He radiated Venus. He also radiated the sun somewhat through his sun in Leo, but he was a Venusian guy. He was magnetic. He was charming. He was smooth. Not all people liked that. Of course, that's how politics works these days. There was a contingent of people, who didn't necessarily relate to the Venusian part and wanted a more Mars part. And so enter Donald Trump. Now, this presentation is not going to be about whether we like or dislike somebody. At least that's not where I come from. I'm just going to evaluate the astrology. Donald Trump is absolutely keyed to the frequency of Mars. Absolutely. I mean, look at his chart. This is set for 2016, July of 2016. I'm trying to remember why I know why I set it for July of 16 instead of November 16. I wanted to illustrate during the election year, the big solar arc that was going on for Trump, which I looked at this and I thought, it's quite possible he's going to win because of this particular art. And that is solar arc sun equaled his ascendant. And it was exact in July of 16. 5 months before the election? Does that bother me? No, not at all. Not at all, because that's when he's actively campaigning. And that sun equal the ascendant will still be very active during the election. And he's a full moon baby. Like Kamala Harris. Wait till we get to Kamala Harris. So, his sun hit the ascendant, the moon would follow in a few years and hit the descendant. Well, that's very powerful. In addition to receiving a solar arc from Venus, receiving a solar arc from the sun is also just as glorious, because that's when a big spotlight is on you. That's when, you are standing in beams of light. You get to radiate and glow. But in addition to that, Trump had solar arc Pluto equaling his Jupiter at the time of the election. It was exact in December of 2016. So you see Pluto over here in his 3rd house, hitting his Jupiter, ruler of the 5th house contests, 5th house gambling or elections or winning, Pluto equaled Jupiter. I saw that and went, oh my God, sun equals ascendant, Pluto equals Jupiter. That's pretty auspicious.
And on top of that, I believe early December, he had his Jupiter return in
Mhm.
2016 as well, just to add, to compound this element of
Yes.
expansion and good luck.
Yes, with layers and layers and layers.
Mm.
Now, for Trump, I want to explain a notation here I have on his chart, which is I have Pluto circled in this blue circle. That is depicting the fact that in the orbs that I use for aspects, Trump's Pluto is unaspected. So I'm looking at unaspected by Ptolemaic aspect. It might have minor aspects. I can't remember right off the top of my head. Using the orbs that I find reasonable, unaspected planets become a very dominant part of the life purpose. His Pluto rules the fourth house of real estate, and he's a real estate mogul. But I wanted to explain that notation. The other thing in the chart is look at the arrow here for his Saturn. His solar arc Saturn hit the Aries point. And so again, Saturn hits the Aries point, high visibility, and then all this other activity. And he was elected. And it was perhaps, whether you agree with him or you disagree with him, it was an auspicious moment in his chart.
Absolutely. And not everyone's going to look at the charts the same way, but I just want to look at the dignified planets in these solar arcs. We've got an exalted Saturn, Venus domicile, Mars domicile, Jupiter for 24 years at that period. In domicile, we've got Venus ruling that midheaven as well. So the strength of these planets are just remarkable, along with everything that you've put together as well. Absolutely.
Yes. Yes. So now we want to look at when he lost the election in 2020. And I want to remind you that you are looking at the solar arcs for 2016 so that you can use your eye to advance some planets forward. And of course, as soon as he was elected in 2016, I saw, well, in 4 years, he's going to have solar arc Uranus on the ascendant. Now, again, do I say, ooh, that's negative? He might lose. No, I don't, because contact angles is powerful. And as we develop this more, I mean, remember, Obama had contact from Neptune to an angle and he won. So, sometimes these things that we think are bad really are not necessarily so bad. But solar arc Uranus equaled ascendant in September 2021. That was after he lost the election. But he went through a Uranian year. Everything was topsy-turvy for him. And transit Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto was opposite his Venus. Well, Venus rules his midheaven when he lost in 2020. So it was a big deal. And in the bottom line, there are many, many people who run for office who have lots of angular contact who don't win. But that angular contact is saying it's a big deal in life. Something major is happening. We don't always know if it's going to be a win or a loss based on it, but we know there's going to be big development. And that's what I think is important. So if we look at when Kamala Harris was elected vice president in 2020, when she and Biden won the election, what is fascinating to me is that Kamala Harris is a full moon person, just like Donald Trump. And, when you have a full moon and that sun and moon move to hit an angle by solar arc, I mean, again, you have to pay attention to this. It's once in a lifetime if it happens at all. So she had solar arc sun equals descendant in December of 2020 and solar arc moon in February 2021. Now, what's fascinating about Harris is during an election, I watch all debates, both sides. I pay attention very closely to the charts. And when Harris was in the running to try to be the nominee for president, she was not polling well. She wasn't very popular. She wasn't doing that well. And I was perplexed about it because she had this building solar arc sun to her descendant. And I kept thinking, this is just weird, because even prior to all the debates, I looked at that and went, she has a very, very strong chart. Let's see what takes place. Well, she dropped out, but then she got selected to be the vice president because of this measurement. I mean, it had her stand out. She also at that point had transit Jupiter and Saturn squaring her sun and moon. Okay, that's helpful. It's not as strong as solar arc sun on the descendant, but it's helpful, right? And she had transit Jupiter later transit Jupiter, Saturn, then advancing to square her Mercury, and Mercury rules her ascendant and her IC. So it's a classic example. You have got to notice when the sun hits an angle. And again, if your life is on track and you are cooperating with that signal, it could be a very powerful period. If your life is off track, if you've spiraled into depression, if you're an alcoholic, a drug addict, if you've spiraled into horrible negativity, then instead of necessarily having a shining moment, you will have some sort of correction. You will have a moment from the universe that helps you get on track. But in this case, she got offered vice president and she won.
It's really good that you're reiterating that point of the context of where the person's life is. So just because you see opposition, squares, etc., if you're already on the life path and you constructed your life well, doesn't necessarily mean something's going to come along and blow it all to smithereens. And I think that seems to be the point you're making here.
Yes, and you can have all this activity and still not win. But these signals are important. Angular contact, angular contact. All right, so now we look at Joe Biden for 2020 when he won as president. And he had solar arc Uranus squaring his Mercury at that time. Well, Mercury rules the descendant, angular contact. Okay, it was exact in May of 2020, 6 months before the election. It doesn't matter. He was campaigning then. He had solar arc Saturn equaling his nodes, conjunct his nodes. Depends on if you use true or mean nodes, but with the nodes that I use, it was solar arc Saturn on the nodes. Well, when the nodal axis receives contact by solar arc or transits, I think it's a pivot point in life. It's a major pivot point. That was exact after the election, but the nodes connect us with the public. That's the other thing about the nodes. He had transit Neptune conjunct his IC that year. And again, a lot of people would go, ooh, that's bad. But what was going on for him was a whole lot with his son, Hunter Biden. There was a lot going on under the surface at that time with Hunter Biden. Didn't stop him from winning, though. And transit Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, opposite his Jupiter. Jupiter rules the ascendant. So ruler of the ascendant, a ruler of angles being contacted at the time that he won. And there we go, right?
Really interesting. You highlight the solar Uranus equals Mercury, ruling the ascendant and the midheaven as well, bringing in that connection and being elected president, those kind of themes popping up. Remarkable.
Yeah, I failed to mention it also rules the midheaven, which is really, really important. Now, I have done a lot of work on Joe Biden's chart. And for the past year, I have said that I think there's a health issue. I've said it starting a year ago based on some of these measurements in his chart and based on what I observed with him, not just the measurements, but what I observed. And I took a big risk and I said some of that and I got a lot of flack. I got some criticism, but I was just looking at the measurements and looking at the behavior. And he did indeed exit the race in August of 2024. And look what's happening in his chart. Transit Saturn this year is now on his IC. Transit Jupiter is square his IC. But what's more important, transit Uranus in his 6th house, opposite his Mercury, ruling the descendant in midheaven. In his 6th house of health, opposite Mercury in the 12th house. And that could be problematic when you're 80. You might look at that differently when you're 20. When I see something in the 6th, aspecting something in the 12th or ruler of the 12th or any of these combinations, I go, okay, well, is your health strong? He also had transit Uranus opposite the sun, Venus. Okay, it's opposite the sun. It's not quite opposite Venus yet, but it's within 1 degree. All right. And transit Mars was there in July of 2024. And look what happened, right? Transit Pluto this year has been squaring his moon, which rules the 8th house, and solar arc Pluto coming to oppose his moon exact in April of 2025. Now that's pretty big. That's pretty big. And I focused a lot a year ago on the potential of life force diminishing by the transit Uranus in the 6th opposite those 12th, and transit Pluto and solar arc Pluto aspecting the moon overlapping at the same time. And then solar arc moon coming to Jupiter next year in the, ruling the ascendant in the 8th house. I'm not predicting whether he's going to live or die. I'm not doing that. No, that's unethical. But I did see his life force diminishing. And then he dropped out of the race.
It's really interesting you bring up the health component, because as I was looking at the charts back in 2020, I was looking at the charts. I actually did think he would become the next president of the United States, which he did. But I did look ahead further, and you bring up that health component. And there's just something, it just came from somewhere else. But I just thought of cognitive decline. And of course, that has been an issue, that debate he had with Trump. I felt so sorry for him. I was just watching him trying to get out the words, trying to articulate what he's trying to say. Obviously, not the best at the best of times with his stutter from childhood, but you just felt that pressure. And of course, all the pressure from the establishment, Democrats coming on top of him and saying, this is maybe a time to pass the torch and maybe move aside. And what a selfless act for him to do that.
Well, and he's got Neptune at the Aries point in his natal chart. And so what was shining and what people saw him through the lens of Neptune at the Aries point, and you just said the word selfless.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But it's fascinating. He's also going to have solar arc, or also is having solar arc Saturn squaring the ascendant. You can see it listed on there. So there's a lot. We'll see what happens for him in the next year. But, it's fascinating to look at.
Absolutely.
All right. So now enter Harris becoming the nominee and picking Waltz as her running mate. We don't have a birth time for Waltz. So I'm not going to talk about the vice presidential running rate mates in this because it's just too many charts too. But so let's look at Harris now coming into the spotlight because she becomes the nominee. And it's fascinating because the aspects are not as auspicious in my mind as they were for 2020, but there are some aspects that stand out. First of all, transit Uranus conjunct Jupiter. I looked at that 6 months ago, Jupiter ruling the descendant, and I view contact between Uranus to Jupiter or Jupiter to Uranus, the old Isabel Hickey phrase. I think it was Isabel Hickey who said, that's the thank the Lord cycle. It's a sudden break. Usually more when Jupiter hits Uranus, but also when Uranus hits Jupiter. I've seen that prevail again and again and again. So she had that contact and woof, she became the nominee. There it was. Ruler of an angle, ruler of the descendant, being hit by Uranus.
And the midheaven as well.
And the midheaven as well. Since I'm so used to modern rulerships, I don't
think... sorry, I didn't... Yeah, I just...
Traditional rulerships, absolutely. Yes, you're absolutely. She also has solar arc Mercury. You see this arrow pointing at the tail end of the Aries point right now, which doesn't hurt. I think the Aries point ends at the end of the first degree in a cardinal sign, but it's still there. And so that helps. She has solar arc Sun coming to the Aries point in the next few years. That's something to take note. She has transit Pluto square her Mercury. Mercury rules the ascendant. So there we have the angular contact. Okay. And solar arc Saturn opposite... transit Saturn opposite the 3 Virgo planets in her 4th house. Now there is one measurement that is not a conjunction, square, or opposition that I think is interesting and I want to mention, which is solar arc Neptune will be semi-square her midheaven on election day, right at that time. And again, I've heard some astrologers say that's not auspicious, and I go, oh, come on. Other people have won with Neptune cycles all over the place. It's just energy, it's contact. So we shall see. We shall see, right?
Absolutely.
But it's not as slam dunk obvious to me as it was in 2020, because that contact in 2020 was so strong. It was a wave I couldn't deny. She's got some strength here, but this is an interesting election because of so many factors, and here we have RFK, who ran as an independent and didn't really get traction, had a whole lot of interference, had a whole lot of static, had a whole lot of problems. What we see is a 5:32 p.m. birth time here. This is not 100% verified birth time, so I have to state that right off the bat. I did a podcast, the Maverick podcast that I do, earlier in the year with my dear friend Hiroki Nizato, who's a great astrologer. And we did a sunrise chart with no birth time for that because it hadn't been revealed that 5:32 p.m. is his possible birth time. But it's third hand birth time. But yet, if we use this and we look at the chart, look what's going on. He's got transit Pluto on his descendant, if this is the correct birth time. Now that just makes a lot of sense. And secondary progress moon is going to hit his descendant. So when the secondary progress moon hits an angle, which is just a 1 month hit, but still it's an activator. So that's going to be happening in October. In 2023, when he changed from Democrat to independent, he had transit Pluto conjunct his sun. So, we know he's been going through that really intense Pluto transit to his sun. Pluto is still transiting his Mercury, and it's back exact right now. Pluto's just re-entered Capricorn for September, October, November of this year. So he's having Pluto on his Mercury. But isn't it interesting? August of 24, he suspended his campaign and endorsed Trump. And at that exact time, he had transit Jupiter conjunct Jupiter. Transit Mercury was retrograde conjunctus Pluto, which is a little bell hit, which would indicate an announcement. The secondary progress moon is building, and transit Pluto conjunct his descendant. What's fascinating to me is RFK's Jupiter hits Trump's Uranus, if I'm correct. I think it's his Uranus. Yeah. And there was a lot of activation on the day when RFK endorsed Trump. But the bottom line here is, if this is the correct birth time, there was angular activity going on. That's what's, and that secondary progress moon is something to pay attention to.
It seems like there's a good case to be made for this particular time. I know when I was looking, I was struggling to find a particular time, but that's really an interesting case you're making there. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there was one other thing, which is, solar arc Mars. See Mars in his 6th house by solar arc at 27 degrees has been conjunct his sun, and sun rules the ascendant at using this birth time. And that's been ongoing for the past year. You see it's about 8 months after. I don't have the exact date when it was exact, but that's when he was churning and burning, trying to get his name on the ballot, pushing forward. And he had Mars equals sun rules the ascendant. He was making a statement of his identity and changing his identity. And so again, angles.
Off topic, but I've got a sneaking suspicion there was some collusion back there. But again, that might be a different topic for a different video. But I think there was something else going on where there was some back channels, and it was always going to be the case, I think, that he endorsed Trump. Anyway, that's up for debate. And...
Sure. Well, I mean, RFK is a Capricorn. He's a full moon baby too, which is fascinating, right?
Incredible. All those full moon energy baby candidates.
Yeah, his full moon wasn't exact. I mean, it's not an exact opposition. It's 12 degrees apart, but still he's full moon phase.
Waxing and it's moving on. Yeah.
But he's a Capricorn. And Pluto is on his Mercury. Capricorns advance strategically strategy and systematic approach. And, if Trump wins, Kennedy will get some sort of position. It's better than no position, I guess, right?
Like you say, I think it's been planned. It was in the works for a while.
Very likely. Very likely. Okay, so now we go to Donald Trump for this 2024 election, and we look at the activity happening for him. I put as the number one measurement here, or at the top measurement, solar arc Uranus will be semi-square his natal Jupiter ruling the fifth exact. It was exact this year, May of 2024. And I only mention that because he had solar arc Pluto on his Jupiter when he was elected the first time. And, Jupiter ruling the fifth, he's taking a chance. He is advancing. That doesn't mean he will win, but isn't it interesting that there is something going on to his Jupiter, even though it's a semi-square?
Absolutely.
Look what's coming up. Solar arc Neptune equaling his nodal axis. Now, that's not angular, however. That's interesting. And then solar arc Neptune will advance to hit his moon. All right. So, of course, if you don't like Trump, you're going to go, ooh, that's bad. And here's where political astrology is very difficult, especially during this time when we have polarization so strong and we have a reaction to the candidates that we often cannot control. And then we look through the lens of bias. And, if you don't like Trump, you're going to go, that's got to be bad. That's got to be bad. I want to count on that being bad. If you do like Trump, you're going to go, maybe it's not bad.
It's a really excellent point, because the videos I've done on this presidential election cycle, I always make a point at the beginning of the videos. I'm saying, listen, I'm looking through my own lens and my own political biases here. So you have to take that into account before you watch the rest of the video.
Yes. And this is why I don't tend to make public predictions about presidential elections, because I try very hard to be neutral, but I don't always succeed. But what's interesting, Neptune on the nodes, well, he's going to be sentenced soon, about the same time that Neptune is on the nodes. And the perception of his sentencing will be different based on if somebody likes Trump or not. So that's going to be fascinating. Is he going to be a victim or victimized? Is this going to be just? What's going to happen? Is it going to take him out of the race? Who knows? Who knows? But isn't it fascinating? He was supposed to be sentenced in July, and it got moved to September, right when this aspect's taking place. And instead, look what happened in July. Transit Uranus was conjunct his midheaven still. It's going back and forth. It's still in play. That is an active transit for Trump. So there's the angular contact. Transit Uranus, bam, right on his midheaven. And when the little bell Mars came and joined that configuration, he got shot. July of 2024. And that was a stunning display of one way astrology could manifest. I certainly didn't predict he was going to be shot, but I did say to many people, we've got to be looking at when Mars activates the midheaven and joins Uranus. We've got to look at that. That's angular. It's going to be something big. And he got shot.
Incredible event. And I remember Celeste Brooks, we were doing the forecast in July, and she was talking about Algol being in the picture as well, and heads of states. And it's just quite remarkable how many astrologers were like, ooh, what's going on here? What can happen?
Well, what's interesting, though, is I have Algol rising in my chart. I have 27-degree Taurus ascendant, and I have Mars conjunct my ascendant natally. So right off the bat, I've been receiving a transit from Uranus to my natal Mars and my ascendant. And I had some students go, ooh, you just better stay home and avoid all accidents and kind of hide in your house. And I went, nope, it's going to be fine. It doesn't, I'm not going to energize. It has to be an accident. It has to be bad. And sure, I'm mindful and I'm careful, but it's not always a negative. In fact, I've had my busiest year in astrology ever. So it's been very, very positive for me. So again,
I absolutely love your perspective on this, because my mind, I'm fairly, I like to be positive, but I have that gnawing British sense of what the shoe's going to drop sort of mentality. But I love this fresh perspective of, not always feeding the energy, or yes, being mindful, but I just love where you're coming from with this.
Well, this is why I have a podcast called the Maverick Podcast. I am inherently very rebellious in, don't tell me how something has to be. I get to create it. But, that doesn't always serve me.
I love that. And I will say, for everybody watching, you have a brilliant channel, and the Maverick series that you've got. I'll leave those links in the description for everybody watching as well.
Oh, thank
Absolutely
you.
wonderful.
So the biggest thing for Trump this year is this angular contact from Uranus to his midheaven. And again, you could say, well, that's unstable, that's unpredictable, that's surprising. It's contact. It's contact. And we don't know who's going to win. He's got transit Jupiter conjunct Uranus coming up, ruling his descendant, going back and forth, and transiting Jupiter coming to that configuration with his sun and nodal axis. Okay, so the sun rules his ascendant. So he's got activity. He certainly has activity. That would put him in the presidential picture, just like Kamala Harris. The bottom line is, even if you get the nomination, you've achieved something significant. And, I would always anticipate there would be angular activity when things like this are going on. I mean, JD Vance, I haven't shared his chart. I have it in front of me. We do have a birth time for JD Vance, who is the running mate for Donald Trump, and his midheaven is 22 Taurus. Well, that's all I have to say, right? Uranus, 22, Uranus gets back to 23. So it's, it's very close. But Vance has 23, Venus at 23 Leo, and ascendant at 28 Leo. So his Venus is receiving contact, and it's the ruler of his midheaven. And here he is being asked to be the running mate for Donald Trump.
It's quite interesting, because I've heard people talk about JD Vance as being a clone of Donald Trump, or the mini me, so to speak. And don't they have, same house system, rising, midheaven, all those lines? Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. And, I don't think Trump chose well when he chose Mike Pence, because they really didn't have harmony between each other astrologically. I
think politically it worked fairly. Obviously, the end didn't work out well, certainly for Pence, but politically, I think it worked fairly well, in that Pence thought, right, I'm going to be this serious, conservative, evangelical type, be the quieter one in the background, who is, in quotes, more serious, while Trump runs off with his out of bounds Mercury and rambles on. I think what Trump has done this time is just doubled down on this MAGA type, and of pretty much making a clone. So whether that's going to help him politically or not, personally, I don't think so, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah. And Tim Waltz, we don't have a birth time for him. Come on, Waltz, release your birth time. Come on. So we don't know if there's angular activity, but I would anticipate there is. Yeah. I would anticipate there's an arc or a transit to the ruler of an angle, or to the angle itself, because he sort of came out of nowhere for this and got the nomination. Absolutely. So there we are. Through this whole thing, we can appreciate how important it is to receive contact to an angle, or ruler of an angle, and how life development is really huge. It's a turning point in life. We can anticipate that when we look at any chart. And so when I'm looking at a client's chart and I'm looking ahead to see when they may have development to an angle or a ruler of an angle, and then I look back to the now and say, okay, it's leading to something. And then you ask, what do you want? What do you want to develop? Where's your life heading? What's going on? How can you use this upcoming angular contact? Right now I have solar arc sun on my midheaven, which is a very nice solar arc. In addition to transit Uranus on my ascendant, it's angular. And I'm working 7 days a week right now. I'm really busy. And I'm thankful for those aspects.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, Kathy, thank you so much for such a brilliant presentation. I think really for me, this has been a teachable moment. And I just love your perspectives, the way you talk about the charts. And I've really learned something from how you put this together and things that I need to adjust myself and keep in mind before I say things. So thank you so much. For me, on a personal level, more of a teachable moment. And thank you so much for pulling all this together and just giving an extra perspective and a fresh perspective that I think is very, very important. Let's talk about your class coming up. And so if you can tell everybody the dates and times.
September 22nd is when the class begins. Prediction Practicum, The Art of Forecasting. It's a 5-week course. It is intensive. It's going to really focus on being able to communicate what you are seeing in the future for a client, not with, I predict you will lose your job in 2025, but from there is huge development coming in with you. How's your life currently going and what do you anticipate? So I focus in that course on using the energies that are happening, actively educating the client on what those cycles can offer you and how you can jump in and use them and direct them where you want them to go, not being victimized by them. Not saying, hey, Pluto's coming to an angle, your life's going to fall apart. Let me tell you about that in advance. So we talk quite a bit about the ethics of prediction. We talk quite a bit about how to communicate this information so that you're not implanting fear or limitation in the client, but how to put it all together simply. So what I wanted to do in this presentation, All Important Angles, was to really highlight the simplicity of understanding how important the angles are. And sometimes when it is so obvious, you can just stop right there. Sometimes you don't need layers and layers and layers and layers of measurements. When that measurement is so loud, you can just stop.
Back to the bells. I love that.
Back to the bells.
Little bell, big bell. Absolutely wonderful. So for everybody watching, I'll leave a link to the course where you can sign up, both in the description and comment boxes. And lastly, Kathy, can you talk about your work, where people can find you? We can talk a bit about your podcast, brilliant YouTube channel as well.
Oh, thank you. And my YouTube channel is Rose Astrology, and I have some guided meditations there. I also have my monthly forecast videos, and I have my Maverick podcast videos there also. I'm doing the Maverick podcast more sporadically these days, just simply because I'm seeing so many clients right now. I don't have as much time. But the Maverick podcast is exploring the Maverick personality, the Maverick within us. And so my website, roseastrology.com, YouTube channel, Rose Astrology, easy to remember. So if anybody wants a consultation, I'm booking 4 or 5 months out right now, but and teaching a lot of classes.
I was wondering with consultations how long it would take with you being so busy.
Yeah.
Absolutely wonderful. Well, Kathy, thank you again for such a brilliant and insightful presentation. And now to reiterate for everybody watching, the links in the description and comment boxes. And thank you so much for taking your time out of such a busy schedule as well to put this together for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks for always being such a gracious host. That is a skill and you do it well.
Wonderful. I appreciate the kind words. Thank you so much. Well, thank you everybody for watching, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye for now.